Good afternoon, everybody. 2 weeks ago, when the issue of lobbying was raised with me, I said that I would have a look at the rules and identify whether there were any further steps that we could take to strengthen them, and I've done that. Today I'm announcing several steps that we're going to take to introduce greater transparency around the lobbying that happens here at Parliament. It is important that we have a sensible and transparent system that doesn't give the impression that lobbyists enjoy unfair advantage over other New Zealanders. That's why I'm setting out 4 changes that I believe will help to build greater transparency and balance around lobbying. First, I've commissioned a significant piece of work that will look at policy options for regulating lobbying activities. To do it well, that will require consultation and a good amount of time. I anticipate that advice will come back to government next year. This was last looked at in 2012, and ultimately it didn't land because it was too broad in scope, and also because the majority of the Parliament did not agree to it. I want Parliament to take another look at that, learning the lessons from that process. While that work's underway, there are 3 measures that I think we can take now that we can put in place relatively quickly and that will have a positive benefit. The first is to remove swipe card access for lobbyists. Currently, some lobbyists, as well as business and union representatives, have swipe card access to the parliamentary complex. My view is that they should go through the front door like every other New Zealander. This isn't, however, my decision. Access to Parliament is controlled by the Speaker, but I've written to him today to express the government's view that this access should be removed. I want as much as possible for it to be a bipartisan issue, and I call on other political parties to support that measure. Second, I'm calling on the third-party lobbyists themselves to develop a voluntary code of conduct that would help to enhance transparency, for example, by including the names of the clients that they represent on their websites. Others involved in lobbying, for instance, peak bodies, industry associations and other entities, could also sign up to the voluntary code. The government will offer assistance from the Ministry of Justice to help draft that code and to draw on overseas practice and guidance if that's useful. Thirdly, a refreshed Cabinet manual will be published later this month that makes it very clear that while in office, ministers' conduct and decisions should not be influenced by the prospect or expectation of future employment with a particular organisation or sector. Further change in that area could be a result of the broad-ranging review that I signalled as the first step we're taking. Today I am also publicly releasing the terms of reference for the review into Stuart Nash's ministerial communications with donors. The review, which I announced last week, will be carried out by the Secretary of the Cabinet, and it's expected to report back within 2 months. It will look at whether there were any other breaches of Cabinet collective responsibility or confidentiality, or perceived or actual conflicts of interest in communications he had with people and entities who made declared donations to his 2017 or 2020 electorate campaigns. Communications that are in scope include those of letter, email, text message, WhatsApp or Signal between the 26th of October 2017 and the 28th of March 2023 when Mr Nash held ministerial portfolios. I think New Zealand should rightly be proud of our open and accessible government, but I also know that New Zealand is a bit of an outlier internationally in our regulation of lobbying. And I hope that these measures will go some way to further increase the confidence that New Zealanders can have in the transparency and the integrity of the government and its processes. Now on to the week ahead. Tomorrow evening I have got a call with the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. On Wednesday I'm meeting the US Ambassador on Wednesday night for validatory of and next will be on Easter Tuesday, the 11th of April. Happy to open up for questions.
You said that
Jessica up the back.
Prime Minister, with Stuart Nash, is this the best outcome for you, or did you try and talk him out of standing down at the next election?
As I indicated last week, ultimately this was Stuart's decision to make. We did have a conversation about it last week, and I made it clear to him that it was his decision to make and his decision to communicate, and he's done that.
Are you pleased that he's not standing again?
As I've indicated, look, I respect Stuart's decision. It was his decision to make, and I wish him well.
2 weeks ago you said that lobbyists have the same access to ministers as the general public. What's changed your mind?
Ultimately, swipe card access doesn't actually give lobbyists any guaranteed extra access, but I think symbolically it is something that has been picked up on and noted, and it certainly creates the perception of increased access.
When was the last time that you met with a lobbyist? Who were they and what did they want?
I certainly have interacted with people who I know to be lobbyists. In terms of a specific meeting with a lobbyist, I can't recall. I'm not even sure that I would have done that in my time as Prime Minister. But I've certainly interacted with people who are lobbyists.
This voluntary registration, essentially that's a license for lobbyists to regulate themselves. Why doesn't the government go further and actually enshrine into law, or have something with a little bit more teeth around ensuring that lobbyists disclose who are their clients, essentially?
I wouldn't rule that out. So, as I indicated, the first bit of work that I've commissioned will come back to government with a range of options, and that may well be one of them. But obviously, we have to do the detailed work to make that possible. There was a bill in 2012. It ultimately didn't receive a sufficient support across the Parliament. I was one of the people that was relatively supportive of that legislation at the time. As I said, definitional issues were one of the things that really tripped up that particular bill, because the definitions in it were so wide. So that's all the work that can be done through a good policy process that will give us some better options.
Are you able to tell us if you know how many people currently have lobbyist access?
80 something, I believe. Yeah.
Cool down period, one of those options that could be considered in that longer piece of work as well?
Yes, I think so. Again, looking at the international examples, New Zealand's a bit of an outlier in not having anything in that space. Again, it's a complex piece of work to work through because whilst there are some very clear examples, so someone leaving a parliamentary or ministerial career to become a lobbyist, that's fairly clear. They may go on to another job where they have some interaction with government policy processes, and we wouldn't necessarily want to say to people who have been members of parliament or ministers that they couldn't go back to the work they were doing prior to taking up those public office roles because there may be some interaction. So I think, again, definitional issues will be very important there.
I've mentioned third-party lobbyists, so that's a starting point, I suppose, is it, from differentiating people who work from a set-up government PR firm from a Dairy NZ or an industry lobby group. Is that the first kind of start to define the different roles, because there are obviously in this space?
Yes. So I mean, like I said, there's some clear-cut examples. So someone who engages in paid lobbying for a fee, that's fairly clear-cut. On the other hand, someone who might leave Parliament and take up a job as, say, a chief executive of a non-government organisation that has a relationship with government, that's not quite so clear-cut. So again, I think we need to work our way through that.
And that'll be the work that longer bit looks at the definition being a past stumbling block. So it's really important to get that clear.
Yeah, and I also think there's an opportunity again to do some broader consultation with all those involved to make sure that what we come up with is A, sensible and fair, B, it's implementable and it can actually work, 3, it's drawing on international best practice. I think we've got the opportunity to do that and to do it properly.
Do you think we're falling well short when you look at other international standards?
I've certainly seen enough to suggest that there is a gap here and that we should look at it. Yeah. Up the back, Luke and then Joe.
Is there any, what's the point of all this? Is there any evidence there's a lobbying problem in New Zealand?
I think New Zealand has a very good reputation internationally, as a transparent and corruption-free or relatively corruption-free country. But that doesn't mean we can be complacent about it. Perception is incredibly important here, and so making sure that in addition to our actual practice, being democratic and transparent, that actually perceptions reinforce that as well.
Just on your distinction there between third-party lobbyists and peak groups, unions, Business NZ, whatever. What's your interaction over your time as a minister been like with lobbyists? On the one hand, first obviously the unions and the peak groups, and then the third party ones. I mean, have your interactions ever been useful? They're sort of well paid pains in the arse.
To be honest, I haven't actually had a lot of direct engagement with lobbyists. I've certainly had quite a bit of direct engagement with people who are employed by, say, non-government organisations that have a relationship with government. Unionists. I've certainly had, plenty of interaction with the teacher unions in my previous role as Minister of Education, or with other groups who have a direct interest in the activities of government. But in terms of the work of paid lobbyists, most of that interaction would be at the more informal level, and it's very hard to control against, because you see people at events, they'll talk to you, and so but in terms of direct engagement on issues that someone might be paying them a fee to represent their views on, I haven't had a huge amount of sort of exposure to that. Joe.
Have any lobbyists been consulted or indeed lobbied ministers in regards to these new measures that have been proposed?
No, I haven't spoken to any of them, and nor to my knowledge, well, I shouldn't say that actually. I certainly haven't spoken to any of them. This isn't something we've consulted on, but now, as I've indicated, in terms of the development of a voluntary code, it's something that actually we would like to lead the process on that with support from us.
Any other ministers who might have potentially, is there another minister who's leading the charge on this, or is this you?
The support will be provided by Justice, should the sector want to take that up, and I certainly hope that they will. And therefore the Minister of Justice will obviously have a role in that.
The 2024 time frame for the Ministry of Justice work, have you sought anything from other parties around how much kind of joint might be for this sort of thing?
I think that's certainly. We will certainly endeavour to do that over the next little while. We've seen indications, for example, I've seen in the public comments from the Leader of the Opposition that the National Party are supportive of further work in this area, which was not something that they were supportive of in 2012. And so, as a result, I think that again gives us more of a platform to move forward and make some progress.
If the goal is to improve transparency and trust in government, why don't you instead focus on making the OIA more robust?
I've looked at the OIA in a number of different, from a number of different angles over the years, and the OIA itself, in my view, is still quite a fundamentally sound piece of legislation. That's not to say that there are opportunities to improve. It was written in the era before digital communication, by and large. So yes, there are going to be opportunities for improvement. But actually, I think some of the big gains are in the areas of practice around how the OIA is implemented. And that's what I was focused on in my previous role as Minister for the Public Service. So proactive release of information, proactive release of cabinet papers, I think is an advance. Proactive release of ministerial diaries, again, a significant advance. The work that we've got the Public Service Commission doing now, and actually monitoring how effective government agencies are in complying with their obligations under the OIA. That's all relatively recent work that's really gained a head of steam in the last 5 years. I'm not going to hand on heart say that adherence to the OIA is perfect. We wouldn't be doing all of this work if it was. Statistics would suggest that we've seen a significant improvement, but there's more room to continue to improve.
The penalties regime, Prime Minister, that's what you said when you were the Minister responsible for state services.
I think what I said was I wouldn't rule that out, and I certainly still wouldn't rule that out.
We're an outlier, and just as you said with the lobbying regulation, we're an outlier. We're an outlier in terms of not having a penalties regime.
Yeah. One of the challenges with the penalties regime is to work out who actually bears the burden of that penalty. Ultimately government can charge itself things. I would be opposed to it being personalised to an individual. So I think those are the sorts of things you'd need to work through with any penalties regime.
Rewriting the Act in this term, that was your promise before the election.
The previous Minister of Justice deferred work on that because of other priorities. Again, I wouldn't rule out that coming back onto the table. Hasn't been on Justice's work program up until now. But again, I wouldn't say that we wouldn't do that work. As I've said, I actually think the big gain, a review of the OIA would take years, and it would not be an uncomplicated piece of work to do. But I think the big gain can be made in making sure that we're implementing the OIA as it's currently intended. Thomas.
Your terms of reference for the review of Stuart Nash's communications excludes his 2011 and 2014 donors. It's about $80,000 worth of donations, includes donations from the likes of Sir Bob Jones. Isn't there an argument to be made that the communications between those donors deserve to be scrutinised as well?
These are the donations I guess Stuart received as a minister or immediately prior to becoming a minister. Hence, that's why those are in.
He was going to be he might have been a minister, in those other elections as well. Like 2017, there was no short thing. He was going to be a minister.
I'm not going all the way back to look at donations during that period. There would have been donations to people who were actually ministers in the government at that point, and I'm not going all the way back to look at that either.
Why specifically are you only looking at his personal donations, and why not widen it out to see if he's had any communications with Labour Party donors as well, because the conflict still exists there, right?
The test here, what we're, I guess, trying to establish or trying to make certain of, trying to provide some reassurance of, is that the minister concerned wasn't providing any information that people who were donating to his campaign were gaining additional advantage from having.
But if they were donating to Labour and they were getting information from a Labour cabinet minister, isn't that exactly the same principle?
There's no evidence to suggest that that has happened, and again, this is about getting this is about making sure we're getting a result in a relatively short period of time and identifying where the risk is.
How worried is the Ninth Floor, and how are you about both the terms of reference in this investigation and the Ombudsman reopening their case into the communications behind the OIA?
We'll completely be supporting the Ombudsman's work. Look, I think if I wasn't worried at all, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We wouldn't be having the current review that we're having, and Stuart Nash wouldn't have lost his job. Clearly, there is a perception here, and a reality too, that the rules haven't been followed, and so making sure that we're getting to the bottom of that is important.
So you're expecting the Ombudsman and the terms of reference to find something not politically palpable for the rest of the population to look at?
I'm not going to. Those reviews are now independent of me. So the Cabinet Office, as it has done under successive governments, has a degree of independence in the way it conducts these things, and the Ombudsman certainly does. And so I'm not going to foreshadow what they might find, because it's important that those reviews can do that.
If you're worried, it would suggest that there's something for them to find.
As I've indicated, the substance, which we've already seen, that was out there last week, did concern me. Jessica.
With the lobbying crackdown, is that in any way a response to the recent events with Stuart Nash?
It's certainly a response to recent events. This issue's been raised recently with me. I've looked at the substance of what's been written around lobbying and so on, and I think it highlights a legitimate issue that we should do more work on.
Wasn't really answering. Is it in relation to Stuart Nash?
Not specifically, no.
Can you clarify one thing with the swipe card act as well? What are your expectations with what the Speaker will do now, and will it be from now on, or will that access go and they will lose the swipe cards?
Ultimately, that is a matter for the Speaker. The Speaker will obviously have to consult with other parties, so I'll kind of refer that to him for further comment on that. But I've set out what the government's position on the matter is. Sean.
I just wanted to ask you, given comments by Keir Starmer in Britain, how do you and how does this government define a woman? To be honest, Sean, that question's come slightly out of left field for me. Biology, sex, gender, people define themselves, people define their own genders. Keir Starmer has said that he believes 99.9% of women do not have penises, and I know it's a strange thing for him to say, but given recent events in New Zealand, I'd ask again, how do you define what a woman is? Well, I think as I've just indicated, I wasn't expecting that question, so it's not something that I've pre-formulated an answer on. But in terms of gender identity, I think people define their gender identity for themselves. Self-identification? Yes. What about, if you like, an official or a wider societal sense? Again, I think we have rules in place now. If someone wants to change their gender on their birth certificate, for example, there's a process that they go through in order to do that. I haven't got the process chapter and verse in front of me, but it's available. Anybody can look it up and see what that process is. Just one follow-up. You described that you thought some of Posey Parker's views were abhorrent. Could you tell us which ones? I think some of the
the views being conveyed around the transgender community, some of the sentiment.
Her views.
Yes, some of the sentiment that she's expressed towards the transgender community is abhorrent in my view. Well, that they shouldn't exist. Up the back.
You said you're going to rewrite the cabinet manual. What was so hard to understand about it before?
Well, we've been going through a process of reviewing the cabinet manual, so that process was underway already. One of the issues that's come up since the last iteration of the cabinet manual was this issue around post-ministerial employment. So we've had the opportunity to flesh that out a bit in the new version of the cabinet manual that's going to be released in the next few weeks.
And on a separate topic, are you worried about the
before I provide you with a more detailed comment on that, what I would say is the focus of the government has been on making, on improving the terms and conditions of nurses employed in New Zealand so that it remains a place where they want to stay and they want to work.
Just on the face of it, are you not worried that 5,000 nurses are registering?
Yeah, again, I've asked for some more information on that to see what further detail we can get on that, and I'll reserve my comment on that until I've got it.
Penalties regime, can you clarify what you meant by you're not ruling it out? So is it active work in progress? Are you flagging it in the future? I mean, what status does it have?
I think you would need to go back through a review of the OIA before imposing an additional penalties regime. Now, I'm not committing to that now, but I'm not saying that we wouldn't do it in the future. And if we did, and I wouldn't take penalties off the table as part of that conversation. It's not going to be it's not going to be between now and the election. That's for sure.
So
yes.
Back to the sort of mishandling of the OIA. If it was an oversight, what has been done to ensure this doesn't happen again? And does it sort of suggest a too high workload in ministerial services?
Are you talking about the OIA from last week, the Stuart Nash's OIA in particular? So, as I pointed out last week, ministers are ultimately accountable for what they sign out. So the ultimate responsibility for what is and isn't released, the decision maker is the minister, regardless of who's giving them advice on it. If they're the ones whose signature is on the bottom of the page, I expect them to be accepting responsibility for what does and does not get released. The decision about whether or not the appropriate decision was made about whether or not a particular email was in scope or out of scope is now the subject of an ombudsman's investigation. So I won't make a further comment on that, although I did last week. I'm not going to do that now that the ombudsman's looking at it.
Just back to lobbying. I mean, do you see that do you think there's any difference between someone lobbying for a fee and someone lobbying for a salary? Is it a peak group or a union, for example?
Again, I think that's one of the definitional issues that we came into, that we encountered back in 2012 when Parliament last debated this. So, for example, if you are a teacher or a nurse and you go and you meet your local member of Parliament in order to press a particular issue that's to do with your workplace, you're lobbying, and you're lobbying that's directly related to your employment. But I wouldn't say that that's something that we should seek to regulate in any way. I think that's actually part of living in an open democracy where our members of Parliament are relatively accessible. I continue to take those meetings as a minister, even when they related to my ministerial portfolio. I used to have teachers come and see me in my electorate office to press their case, and I think that that's actually important. I think it's good that local MPs continue to do that. On the other hand, you can then take that up a notch and say, well, what if you're working for the teacher union and you're coming to represent the overall teaching workforce? And then you can take that up a notch further and you can say, well, what if you're one of those kind of peak body representatives appearing before a select committee or meeting with a government minister? So there's layers to all of this. And I think figuring out where you draw the line in terms of what's deemed to be lobbying that should be regulated versus lobbying that's actually just a healthy part of democracy that shouldn't be, I think that's actually quite critical.
You're talking about this voluntary code of conduct. Would be your expectation that it'd be third-party lobbyists, the sort of more, people lobbying within companies or within groups? And what about lawyers? Because there's plenty of lawyers coming here and doing lobbying.
Yeah, and that is actually one of the groups that I think we'll need to work our way through in terms of both the substantive policy work, but also in terms of the voluntary code of conduct. Because
would it be your expectation or your hope that if you were this, code of conduct was widely signed up, then it would actually cover all of those groups?
I think certainly where a law firm is representing a client and lobbying on behalf of a client, I don't really see you could differentiate that from a lobbying firm lobbying on behalf of a client. On the other hand, a law firm engaging in a point of principle around the law, so appearing before a select committee to say there's this loophole in the law that we think needs to be closed, well, you could argue that that's just them being good corporate citizens, and we'd want to encourage that. So I think, again, it comes down to definitional issues and making sure that we've got those boundaries clear.
I suppose on a similar vein, I mean, what about unionists and businesses? Are they separate from this? How does that work?
Well, unionists shouldn't. I mean, unionists, anyone else who wants to appear before a select committee or seek to influence government decision making using those general processes that are available to every New Zealander does not have to register to do that. And I wouldn't want to see a regime put in place which suggested that they should. I think where there are real questions at the moment is where the lobbying is taking place for a fee, and where there's a perception that some people who can afford to pay that fee are getting access to decision makers that others are not.
Walk us through what somebody can do with a lobbyist swipe pass at the current.
It gets them into the building, and it gets them into some parts, mostly public parts of the building. It doesn't get them into the parts, is my understanding, doesn't get them into, say, a minister's office, for example. They'd still have to be invited in and access that separately.
So I know you're doing all of this in a review. What's the point of these then?
That's a very good question. I mean, my view is that they can come through security the same as everybody else does.
Just ahead of Jacinda Ardern's valedictory, how do you think her term as Prime Minister deserves to be remembered?
I think Jacinda Ardern led New Zealand exceptionally well through some amazingly complicated challenges. And I think New Zealand is a better country for her leadership. Not many Prime Ministers in 5 years in office would have to deal with as many significant hurdles as Jacinda Ardern did, from a volcanic eruption, a terrorist attack, a global pandemic. The pandemic alone, I think, would be one of the biggest challenges any New Zealand Prime Minister has faced during their time in office. And I think that Jacinda led us through all of those with dignity, with humility. She had high levels of to what is a tough job.
Ministership's obviously coincided with extreme hate on one side and a very fringe sort of element online, and she's spoken about that. John Clark spoke about that. Are you able to share whether that's died down since her leading office, and what's your message? Does she deserve the chance to live a private life after next week when she?
Well, in terms of the last part of what you've just asked, I absolutely hope that people will leave her alone and let her get on with her job. She's given a lot to New Zealand and has now stepped back from that, and I think the vast majority of New Zealanders already respect that, and I would hope that those who are on the fringes, who perhaps haven't always respected Jacinda or the office that she held, I would hope that they would back off now as well. I don't know how she's found things in the last couple of weeks. I've spoken to her several times, but that's not something that we have talked about. I'm sure she'll share some views on that in due course.
Minister, can you imagine doing this job with that extra layer of misogyny and that extra threat and personal attack that she had to deal with that I assume you're not as a male?
It's a tough job, and I think we should accept that it was tougher for Jacinda as a young woman to do the job, given that she was subjected to a much greater degree of scrutiny than men have been in the same job, a much greater degree of vitriol than men have been in the job. I think one of the great disappointing things for me is that we've seen examples around the world of this before we saw it in New Zealand to the extent that we have in the last last 18 months probably. I think back to some figures, people like Hillary Clinton, who have been subjected to this for over decades. We hadn't seen that in New Zealand until just recently, and I think it's kind of sad that we have in the last 18 months.
Can I just back on? Sorry, you go.
Yeah.
What do you make of reports of thousands of Wellingtonians turning up to a peaceful rally in support of trans people a few weeks ago?
I think it's fantastic, and I think I think we should live in a society where people are free to be who they are, and I'm really proud of Wellington. Wellington's an incredibly inclusive city, and I think the fact that people were there just out of no self-interest, but just supporting those around them, I think is something that we should all be, that we should all celebrate.
Proud of what happened in Albert Park the day before.
I've commented on that already,
Nash,
Sean.
if I can.
Yeah.
You've had one conversation with him since Tuesday last week?
Had a couple of conversations with him, yeah. 2 or 3, I think. Yeah. We had a conversation on Friday, for example. He was, contemplating his future. I was speaking to someone who's worked with him for a long period of time, reflecting on the events of the past week, recognising that no matter what the circumstances leading to where things were at last Friday, Stuart's a human being as well. And so, I had a conversation with him.
Asked him whether he was aware of the email to his donors when you sought assurances post previous cabinet manual breaches?
I don't think I specifically asked him that question, but he should have been aware. He wrote it.
Because it essentially will tell you whether he just forgot or whether he was lying to you, really.
Yeah, it wouldn't have made a material difference to the outcome.
Can you just clarify though, Prime Minister? You're saying that you went to him and you said, is there anything else you need to talk to me about on multiple occasions, and he didn't come forward with that email. So he was holding that back from you. That's correct?
Either holding it back or he may have genuinely forgotten it, but either way, the existence of the email was the thing that meant that I made the decision that he could no longer continue as a cabinet minister.
Is it plausible for you that he could have forgotten that email?
Regardless of whether he did or not, the fact that the email existed was the end of the matter.
But it does matter though, because you're either holding. There's a very big difference between forgetting something and holding something back, don't you think?
But at the end point for me as Prime Minister, the end point would have been the same. He would not have been a minister either way.
Do you see this inquiry more as looking into transparency, trying to rule out any corruption, or could there be consequences for Stuart Nash? Given he's heading out the door anyway, is this more around transparency?
Again, let's wait and see what the outcome of it is before that. I mean, I think once you kick off a process like this, you need to actually allow it to run its course.
Jenna. What is it about a lobbying crackdown that is bread and butter?
I think this is an issue to do with New Zealanders' trust and confidence in the processes of government. Government should continue to be, I think, transparent for us in the building, being transparent and being accountable for the actions that we take. That is something that's part of our everyday work.
Are you trying to distract from the Stuart Nash thing?
No.
Just as a reference.
I'll wrap up in a moment, yeah.
Sorry, do you have any reason to believe that there will be more? Has he given you any assurances that this was it?
As I've indicated, I'm just going to wait and see the outcome of the review before making further comment on that.
Do you believe
on
those
the terms of
assurances that
reference?
he gave them to you?
Well, clearly I did 2 weeks ago, and that turned out to not be true.
Are you naive?
I think as a Prime Minister, when you're making these decisions, you can't make decisions based on suspicion or based on conjecture. You actually have to make decisions based on evidence, and there was no evidence that I had at that time.
Then why have you not asked him since? Because you were made to look like whatever you were made to look like by him not coming forward and telling you about this email. So why have you not asked him whether he forgot or whether he hid it from you?
I think I was made to look like someone who has a respect for natural justice.
Just on that, does it not matter to you whether which one it was, personally?
Either way, the existence of the email meant that he could not continue as a minister.
Result. But for you personally, you're a new Prime Minister. I mean, a minister lying to you is not a great thing. Is that not something that you're specifically interested in?
Well, it's an utterly unacceptable thing, but forgetting about something as significant as that is also not acceptable.
So just on these terms of reference, it says the review won't make findings around liability, but may identify further steps that could be taken in respect to such matters. So what are you not ruling out by saying there could be those further steps?
Well, ultimately, it's not up to the Cabinet Office to decide if there's any liability involved here. That would be a matter for other appropriate agencies with the appropriate jurisdiction.
What's not being ruled out there? Would it be a recommendation? Or
well, until the outcomes of the review are known, it's kind of it would be crystal ball gazing to to suggest what it might throw up. Okay, thanks everybody.